By show of hands, can I see how many people here today in this audience use poetry to solve important psychological problems? Please raise your hand if you've done that. Quite a few of you do. How many of you here in this audience use poetry to save lives? By show of hands, can you show me how many? Some of you do that too. Today, what I'm going to do is to show you how I use poetry in my practice and in my life to solve problems and to save lives. I'm a cancer doctor. For my entire professional career, I've treated children and adults with cancer. And treatment is certainly much better these years than it's ever been before. Many more people are surviving than ever before, but still, there is psychological distress associated with having cancer and going through the cancer journey. But the distress is not just in patients, it's also in healthcare workers. Approximately 300 to 400 doctors every year in the United States commit suicide from burnout and related other psychosocial distress related to healthcare delivery. Not only that, but 50% of doctors and nurses suffer burnout at any given time in the hospital setting. So what are we going to do with all this distress in the healthcare system? Is there a way around it to resolve it? One approach could be expressive writing. We know for many years, the psychologists have shown us for many years, expressive writing helps with suffering. Expressive writing, even just for a few minutes a day, every day, can help to resolve pain and suffering and prevent long-term complications of PTSD and related other trauma. There is now emerging data that the same may be true in cancer and in burnout. Of all forms of creative, expressive writing, poetry is the most poignant. It is packed with emotion, with passion, with ideas, with feelings, with suffering. It is packed with symbols and metaphors, the language of the soul in dealing with these issues. And it is packed with music and rhythm, which can help to synchronize our rhythms, the rhythms of our heart and soul, body and mind, and bring us together and make us whole. Now, there's nothing esoteric about poetry. Poetry is all around us every day of our lives. Many people keep poetry on their refrigerator doors. Many people have poetry, little poems, on the fenders of their cars. A Stitch in Time Saves Nine is a very good poem that we live with. But we all use poetry also every day when we give greeting cards to each other, which are little poems embedded in cards to celebrate our events in our lives. We use poetry every day when we sing songs. Songs are poetry set to music. We use songs when we're happy and when we're sad to express our emotions. And we use poetry when we pray from our holy books, which are mostly poems in worship form. And for the most important moments of our lives, the most seminal moments in life, birth, death, marriage, we reach to poetry to express our feelings. Now, I use poetry in all of my patients. I always encourage my patients to write. Whatever it is that they're feeling, write it down, work it out. Let's look at it together. But today, what I'm going to talk to you about is how I use it in my personal life and how I use it with my colleagues. Years ago, I started having some distress in my practice. I developed some problems sleeping. I wasn't able to sleep. I suffered from insomnia that some of you probably know about. And when I did finally sleep, I would wake up with nightmares and night terrors. And this really began to affect my practice. I looked around me, and I saw my colleagues were suffering also. One colleague, my closest colleague, was going through a divorce the second time around in a short period of time. Another colleague had had it. She was giving up her practice. She didn't want it anymore. And all around me, I saw different manifestations of distress. Here we were, the team in the hospital charged with treating the most seriously ill children in the hospital, children with cancer, and we were falling apart. Now, there were lots of reasons for falling apart in the hospital setting. There's no shortage of reasons. There's hard work, there's long hours, there's night call, there's weekend call, there's not enough sleep, there's not enough good nutrition, there's pressure to write, there's pressure to publish, there's pressure to get kids on protocol, there's pressure to move the field forward. There is pressure coming from all sides. But that was not the problem. The problem was exposure to suffering, such extreme suffering, and the inability to control the outcome, curing every child, which is what we were trained to do, but couldn't do because of life. We recognize these as existential problems, not as administrative problems or workload problems, but existential, the vicissitudes of life we needed to deal with better. So we called in people from the community to help us think it through. We called in the poets, the philosophers, the myth makers, the storytellers, and the psychologists and the psychiatrists. And we sat together and we worked out a plan, what we were going to do. And we came up with a pilot program. And here it is, very simply. We decided we were going to heal through poetry. We would get together every week, once a week, every week, no matter what. We would sit together as a team, and we would write. We would spend 2 hours together. The first hour was writing, and we had rules for writing. We could use paper, pen, pencils, crayons. No computers, no iPads, no iPods, no cell phones. We needed high touch to balance the high tech that we were exposed to every day, high touch. Then we wrote, and we let it all out. Everything that had happened in the last week, all the things that hurt, all the things that felt bad, all the things that felt good, whatever it was, we let it all out. We were very specific, and we loaded the sayings, we loaded the poems with sensory detail. Everything we were feeling, hearing, seeing, touching, we loaded it with that. And then we put it to music. Using the tools of the Poets Toolbox, we put it to music. And the tools, very simply, are rhythm, rhyme, flow, alliteration, assonance, consonance, dissonance, all the tools of the Poets Toolbox. We took them out and we used it to jazz up our writing. In the second hour, we shared what we wrote. And we listened deeply. Probably for the first time, we listened deeply to each other. We listened, we heard, we laughed, we cried, we healed. That was the year I became a poet. I started writing everything that I was experiencing during that year and subsequently until now and hopefully into the future. And I want to share with you some of the poems that I wrote. I can't share the whole poems because it's too long and we only have a few more minutes together. But I selected certain excerpts to share with you, and these are taken from my first book of poetry, which I called Rounding with the Muse. And I want to share with you these extracts and tell you how they affected me. So in my first poem that I'm going to share an excerpt with you, it's called Ordinary Life. In this poem, I imagined what would it be like to be a child in the hospital exposed to such intensive care in the ICU, in the bone marrow transplant unit, in all these high-tech centers, and then go home to ordinary life. What would that be like? So I wrote it down, Ordinary Life. Years ago, it all began, the weakness and the bleeding. Leukemia detected, chemo given, remission joy and relapse sorrow. Then the transplant. Secret cells from his sister saved his life. and bound them to each other for forever. Now cured of disease, released to ordinary life, home at last, but recognizing nothing. Ordinary life. No checking vital signs throughout the night. No morning meds, no nighttime waits, no urinal at bedside rail, no nurses' bells or IV poles, no transplant nurse to take his blood, give transfusions and infusions, or change his hyperaldosteronism to raise the salts and lower sugar. No nurses chiding him to swallow meds, breathe through tubes, cough out phlegm, and exercise his arms and legs, now atrophied from being way too long in bed. Like prisoners of war released back home. Everything's so strange. Everything's so different. Everything's so ordinary. Knowing now how extraordinary ordinary is. That poem helped me to deeply empathize with my little patients who were going through such amazing changes in rhythm of life, not only from extraordinary to ordinary life, but sadly often back to extraordinary life when that needed to be done. In another poem, I wondered what it would be like to be a patient in the hospital and subjected to objectification, which sometimes happens. We sometimes unskillfully refer to our patients as their diseases or as their organs. What would that feel like? So I imagined that in this little excerpt of a longer poem. The name of the poem is The Leg on 6E. As we make our morning rounds, the interns bring me room to room to brief me on my patients. We have 3 patients, my intern says to me. The leukemia on 6C, the myeloma on 6D, and the leg on 6E. The leg on 6C hears us talking. His face turns red and he starts roaring. I'm not the leg on 6E. I'm a man, a whole man, not a piece of meat, not a leg. I'm a man. This poem helped me to empathize deeply with patients and the indignities to which they are sometimes exposed. It also helped me to teach my intern what it felt like, and hopefully that will never happen again. And finally, in one last excerpt that I'll share with you, I imagined what would it be like to be sleepless in the transplant unit. I knew what it was like to be sleepless at home. That was already ongoing for years. But what about in the unit? Here it is. Sleepless in the unit, wondering if he'd survive or not, and if he does, would he buy a plane and fly to distant lands of which he dreamed since early boyhood days? Sleepless, wondering if he doesn't survive, what would become of the woman who chose him as her man, and to those little girls, to him and her, just born. Sleepless, wondering if the donor of his cells, which promised so much life, will ever know to whom her cells had gone and what became of them. Sleepless, hearing the little boy 2 rooms down the hall cry himself to sleep each night, hugging teddy bears, but missing Mommy, who had never been away before. Sleepless, no longer waking up to greet the sun, seeing trees and shrubs and grass, or watching moon trade places with the sun. Sleepless, wondering if he'd ever sleep again. This poem helped me to deeply empathize with the patient, but also family and the little boy 2 rooms down the hall. But then there were other poems I wrote, which I didn't share with anybody. And these I put in a separate book, which I labeled, Help Me Make It Through the Night. Those were the poems that woke me up in the middle of the night. Those were the poems that revealed to me what my issues were. That was my call for help, and poetry revealed it to me. I got the help I needed. It saved my life. So here's my invitation to you. The next time you're suffering from a psychological or other problem, or feel desperate, Try sitting down, writing it out, sharing it with other people, and see if it heals your life the same way poetry healed my life.